Michelle Rosner Saunders, and I am from the class of 1984. And I love what I'm seeing here in the chat with where everybody is from and the definition of power, which is really great to read and observe. Lots of great definitions. So this event this evening is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Council, of which I am a member, and the Women and Gender Resource Action Center, otherwise known as WIGRAC. So it's co-sponsored. And the thing that's so wonderful about this co-sponsorship this evening is because this event is part of the Women's History Month. And so it's fitting that this is co-sponsored this evening by the Women and Gender Resource Action Center. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I want you all to know that this is being recorded, and we hope that you will keep your camera on. We understand if you'd like to have it off, but if you keep it on, it just gives more of that feeling of a unified group together and part of the discussion and meeting that we're all here together to participate in the lovely evening and interact. And it's just so nice to see everybody's faces. So if you can, we would love that. And unless you are speaking, we ask that you remain on mute, just so that we can really hear the discussion, the interview that's going to be going on about the book that we're going to hear about and the author. And feel free to use the chat to ask questions or offer your thoughts throughout this evening. So if you put the questions that you have in the chat, we will make sure to capture them and address them when it's time for questions and answers. So a little bit about the agenda. This is a conversation this evening between Yarel Silverio Marshall, class of 1996, who is the chairwoman of our Women's Leadership Council, and Charity Elder, class of 2000. And the conversation is centered on Charity's book, Power: The Rise of Black Women in America. After the discussion, we're going to open the conversation to audience participation. And if you'd like to ask your own question, should you have one, we will welcome you to do so. Otherwise, we can read your question for you and proceed into the conversation and get some great answers for you. At the end, we will also have a surprise raffle for those who are still present. So I encourage you to stay with us for the evening. So programs such as this are reflective of our mission, the Women's Leadership Council mission. And I'd like to just take a moment to read our mission statement. The mission of the Trinity College Women's Leadership Council is to build and sustain a network of support for all women identifying Trinity College alumni and students. The Women's Leadership Council creates opportunities for mentorship in which alumni connect with one another and/or undergraduates. In addition, the Women's Leadership Council provides experiences and benefits that assist alumni throughout their lives in both personal and professional endeavors. The Women's Leadership Council also encourages alumni to support the college philanthropically and strives to foster an engaged and dynamic community from which to identify future leaders who will help amplify the voices of all Trinity women. I am very happy to be part of this council, and I'd like to introduce our chairwoman, Yarel, as the programming chair, and let her introduce then our guest this evening, Charity. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Good evening, everyone. As you can see, the programming committee is starting to expand, and that means that not everything lies on me. And so Michelle knows how hard it is to have to read the mission statement sometimes, because it's a lot of words. But it's important words for us to all remember and keep notes. So thank you, Michelle, for that. And now I get the pleasure of introducing my friend, Charity C. Elder. And I stress that because we crossed paths when we started. I'm class of 96, she's class of 2000. So we probably saw each other, but didn't know each other. And between reading her book and having conversations with her at various events, I feel like I can call her my friend. So, who is Charity C. Elder? She is an award-winning journalist and media executive with 20 plus years working and leading in broadcast and digital newsrooms, as well as a lecturer at Fordham University's Department of Communication and Media Studies. Selected in 2017 and profiled for NYC Media's Vanguard, Women in Media in 2016, she was named on Folio magazine's list of top women in media. In 2020, she served as a senior advisor to the Mike Bloomberg presidential campaign, advising and strategizing ways to engage the Black community. Prior to joining the Bloomberg campaign, Elder was the head of video and podcast for Yahoo News, leading an award-winning team of innovative producers redefining news in the era of immersive journalism. She also worked for more than a decade as a television news producer at Emmy Award-winning morning shows at both CBS News and NBC News. A Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Trinity College and a Master of Arts in Mass Communication and Journalism from New York University, Elder serves as a board of fellows for Trinity College and on the Jeremiah Program's National Governing Board of Directors, a nonprofit that aims to break the cycle of poverty for single mothers and their children 2 generations at a time. Ooh, and there is a lot more if you go to her website, which we will share later on in the event. But in the meanwhile, can we do our virtual clap of hands to welcome Charity? There we go. Thank you so much. Charity, you ready?
I'm ready. Yarel, thank you so much for that introduction and for reading my entire bio. And yes, you are absolutely a friend of mine, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you more. So I'm excited for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we were getting to know each other, I learned that you grew up in Hartford, and that was part of your journey to Trinity. And given the subject matter, which is basically empowering Black women in your book, how would you say that impacted the story that you chose to share?
Well, I love this question because Hartford is central, as it is, you know, for most people where they grew up and the town and where they're from. But I was born in Hartford Hospital and lived there my entire life. And what is, I would think in connection to the book specifically, which is interesting for me to think about it in this way, is that Hartford is a really diverse city, particularly on the North End where I grew up, where there was a large African-American population, but also a really large Afro-Caribbean population as well. And, you know, during that time when I was growing up, we did not call it Afro-Caribbean, it was Jamaican, it was Puerto Rican, and you know, folks from the South and all in between. But there really was a community of Blackness and of diversity within the Blackness in terms of the diaspora. And also that fostered this community of, you know, in school where I didn't realize it, but they were teaching us a lot of pro-Black, being proud of being Black. We learned the Black national anthem and would sing it before every school assembly. And I know people today who were never taught the national anthem. They'd never heard it before or weren't taught it in school. I remember in my gifted and talented class, Miss Coven, she did a trip to Africa. Now, my father wouldn't let me go, which I was very angry about, but it was, and I've never forgotten actually, but it was the fact that she was bringing elementary school students to Africa and that and that centralness of the African American and Black experience. So I would say, obviously and clearly, Hartford has had a huge role in who I am and how I think and my comfortability and pride in being a Black woman.
And I'm going to bring it back to that at a later point, because as a person of color, there are certain parallels in things that didn't match for me. And that's important to note, with many times the assumptions of having similar backgrounds, and yet they're not that similar. And what does that mean?
Exactly.
What about Trinity? What brought you to Trinity, and how that community differed living in Hartford?
What's interesting for me is that I went through the entire public school system in Hartford. And one thing to really note about that is, during my research, I came across an article from the mid 1990s when I was in high school. And the article it was a Hartford Current article, and it was talking about how poor the education was in Hartford schools. Poor in terms of, yes, it was an economically depressed area, but also that the quality of the public education was not good and was falling behind, not just Connecticut, but nationwide. And so I thought about that, right? And there are a ton of people who came out of and went through, elementary, middle school, high school, and have done very well in terms of the Hartford public school system. And I'm a legacy and a testament to that. What I find interesting, and the point I want to make, is that I did not know Trinity existed. So it was a bus ride away, and I did not know that Trinity existed. And I really was looking at a lot of other schools. And it was a guidance counselor who said to me, Trinity would be really good for you. I just think you would love Trinity. And I was like, anything I can do to get out of Connecticut is what I'm doing. So having lived, going to school there, I was like, there's no way I'm going, 10 minutes down the road on the other side of town to Trinity. And I don't know anything about it anyway. Long story short, I ended up applying, and I applied to 13 schools. I got into all of them. But Trinity gave me a full ride. And I remember sitting in the living room of my grandmother's house, and I got the letter, and everybody just looked at me. It was like, oh, so that's where you're going. And then the conversation kept going. There was no discussion. I had no say. Trinity gave me the most money. And so that's how I ended up at Trinity. And it really, for me, and not everyone has had the same experience. And by everyone, I mean people of, Black people or other people of color have had the same experience that I've had, or that I had at Trinity. But for me, it was a wonderful time. And I say that because I didn't know that there was something called a liberal arts education. And so just that idea of thinking, that learning how to think, thinking critically, being curious, really opened the door to that knowledge. I also thought I wanted to be a doctor, and I went to a biology class. I went to one, and I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. From one of my friends, she was taking a sociology course. I took one. She was majoring, in sociology. She was a year ahead of me. I took a sociology course, loved it, and decided to major in sociology. And if I hadn't majored in sociology, I would not have the sentiment I have now in terms of looking at structures of power, of looking at societies and how people operate within societies, and looking at the bigger picture in terms of how culture and societies are created. And so even as a journalist, I was really interested in human interest stories and telling stories about people who are marginalized, and that really came out of my training as a sociologist. And just fast forward very quickly, in coming to write this book, Trinity, alum, my friends, India Lorick, and then my first roommate, my freshman year, Chrissy Tucker, they were central to helping me with this book. First of all, India, who's a PhD in sociology and teaches, I used one of her theories, the triple consciousness theory in the book, which was really cool to do. And then with Chrissy, she's also a PhD at UNC in North Carolina, and she deals with statistics as it looks at maternal health, and she does a lot of research. So I did a poll with Marist for the book, an original poll of Black women, and I called Chrissy and we were on the phone, and she was like, well, I think that question, if you're trying to get to this. And so as I was working with Marist poll, I had someone who could help me do even better. And then Professor Veloki, who teaches sociology and who is, I saw someone clapping. I saw Katie clapping for that one. I mean, he's amazing. He's retiring this year. And when I called him a few years ago, when I was starting this project, I emailed and I said, thank God you're still at Trinity, because I would have had no other way to reach you. And so he talked me through, and he was a sounding board. And so Trinity has been marvelous for me in terms of my growth as an intellectual, and also just for having the book come to fruition.
It's quite a connection. I feel like you that Trinity, even years after graduating, the resources, knowing that we have those resources, have been quite helpful. And I completely forgot that, yes, you've had not one, not two, but three connections to Trinity in the development of your book.
And they're in the acknowledgements. Yep.
Trinity, give yourselves a little bit of a snaps up. Okay, so with that in mind, and thinking about the roles that has been played, as well as your background in sociology, one of the chapters that drew my attention the first time was, let's see, this is page 83, when you are referring to patriarchy, and the chapter is called A House Divided. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to read a very short excerpt so that people can get a sense of what caught my eye. Patriarchy is essential to understanding the existent power dynamics betwixt Black women and men, and how it manifests in social movements and in the Black church. For decades, Black feminists have been sounding an alarm. The Black community is not exempt from patriarchy. Despite the warnings and work of notable Black feminists, Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, June Jordan, Brittany Cooper, Roxane Gay, and Feminista Jones, to name a few, within Black culture, it remains challenging to acknowledge or confront patriarchy. And I feel that it's fitting this evening, given the fact that we're celebrating Women's History Month, or Her Story, and the transition that Trinity has gone through. It's only been, how many years since it became
the 60s,
co-ed?
Oh, the 60s,
right?
67, early 70s.
Late 70s, I think. So that's shame on me, because January 11th, we did an event on it. But
we celebrated the 50th anniversary of coeducation a couple of years ago.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So this is why we've got women on this in this group, and this is why there's Women's Leadership Council, because there's always someone to help us out.
Women of all ages.
That being said, you know, the in terms of patriarchy, it's something that wasn't considered, especially because we're always talking about strong Black women. And yet you gave a different picture. Can you explain a little bit more in terms of that thinking, and where did it come from? Like, was it part of your research, or was this something that you observed in the spaces that you've been in?
In terms of patriarchy within the Black community?
Yes.
Well, you know, look, the book is informed And the foundation, really is my lived experience and how I view Black women, particularly in the United States. And so what I was looking to do was to substantiate my belief that Black women have power already and don't need to be empowered or given power or shared power with. Essentially, we need to wield our power. And so, and I wanted to prove that with data. So everything in the book really comes out of my lived experiences. And then how does that work with or mirror how other Black women feel? How does that look in terms of research and studies that have been done, other Black women who have studied this in great detail? And so the idea around patriarchy is very much a lived experience. In addition to the research and what other Black women have done, particularly the Combahee Collective, River Collective, their statement that they did, in the 70s, looking at patriarchy and all the writings of the women that you mentioned, particularly for me, Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and Toni Morrison. What I really took away in looking at the construct of power is that Black women have power. We're not necessarily utilizing our power, not just within structural systems in society, but also in terms of our personal power and also in terms of the Black community. And so what has been very true within the Black community is that Black women have known for a long time that patriarchy exists. You go back to Ida B. Wells or Sojourner Truth, and they talk about when there was a battle for suffrage and Black men got the right to vote before white women or Black women, right? That Black men leaned into their gender and the power of that to get the vote first, as opposed to holding out and waiting for Black women who also went through slavery or were enslaved with them. And so that idea has really threaded from, since the end of the Civil War through today, where there's this notion that I write about in terms of seeing patriarchy in the Black community. It's that the freedom for Black people writ large is hinged and predicated on the freedom of Black men. So if Black men have freedom, thereby we all have freedom, which is not true. It is, we all have freedom and we all have freedom. And so I say that, which people who are on this call who are Black and grew up in a Black community, there are things which I call, this really isn't a name of the Black community, I just call it this, the Black Golden Rule. And that rule is that you are never to disparage a Black man, especially in public, and especially if they are very successful. And that is, and if you do that as a Black woman, that's an affront, not just to that individual, but to all Black men and thereby the entire Black race. And so you have this dynamic where Black women have the highest of any racial and gendered group, one of the highest rates of domestic abuse and violence, really high rates of homicide. And homicide is more often, perpetrated by someone in terms of a relationship or an intimate partner relationship. And there have been studies that have been done that Black women, 9 out of 10 Black women are more likely to be dating a Black man than they are any other racial group in terms of men. And so the people who are perpetrating this violence is Black men against Black women. So you have this violence that's happening. You have this idea that we have to uplift and not criticize Black men, particularly in public. And I cite examples of that in the book and the way that plays out. I mean, current examples and also historic examples. And, and then there also is just the idea, my own grandmother, she has 2 sons. This is my dad's mother, just 2 sons, my dad and his brother. And she calls them my boys, my boys. And you will find in a lot of Black households that Black women are treated more harshly with their mothers. More harshly, I mean, there's more expected of them. They're expected to do more, be there, you know, lockstep. And there's this sort of coddling, I'm going to say that word, coddling of Black boys, because there's this idea that racism is harder for them. And so that is why you have Black Lives Matter, which was created by three women who consider themselves Black feminists, and Black feminists in the way where it's not just about gender, it's about race, it's about class, it's about sexuality, it's about all these intersecting approaches. But the thing that gets all the attention is the deaths of Black men and boys. Now, it should get attention, and in actuality, young Black men are more likely than any other group to have these deadly encounters with the police. The point I'm making is not taking attention away from that. The point I'm making is it has never been the death and I'm talking in the context of the police. It has never been the death of a Black woman that has ever created societal change or inspired mass movements. So you look at Emmett Till, that inspired Martin Luther King. I mean, he writes about that and how that really inspired him in terms of the civil rights movement. And then you think of, you know, Rodney King and all the riots that came out of that. And then you think of Trayvon Martin and then George Floyd, right? I can just name off names like this. It doesn't happen the same way for Black women. And I believe that that's because of patriarchy. And you see that patriarchy also within the Black family. You know, I have one of my uncles, he's like, I'm the patriarch because he's the oldest male. I mean, he declared this in a family Zoom during COVID. And I was like, okay, but I know the game. So you know, I understand it. He's wonderful, loving, all those things, but it's that operation of patriarchy. It's that operation where in Black churches, Black women are the ones doing the majority of the work and in the pews, but they're far less likely to be the ones who are pastoring and leading. This happened in the civil rights movement where Black women were maligned in terms of what they had to offer by Black men. Again, this is also substantiated in history. And so for me, it comes, so the title of that chapter, A House Divided, what I'm saying is, and we all know this saying, a house divided doesn't stand or can't stand. My supposition is that Black people will never be able to attain real freedom or full freedom or really work together in terms of freedom if Black men do not let go of patriarchy. Patriarchy is really a tool that was used for white supremacy. And again, this, you know, in terms of Western civilization, you look at the North transatlantic slave trade. When you look at all those things, it is essentially Black men taking a part that is powerful or enables power with this very old 4,000-year-old system called patriarchy and using it in the Black community when it's like, wait a minute, we all went across those ships like you did and had to live. We all were enslaved just like you were. We all endure the remnants of that today. And so I think it's disgusting, really, for Black men to, and then a lot of it is unconscious, but to rely at all on patriarchy, especially when we have the kind of brutality and trauma that was inflicted upon African descendant people.
I love that, especially because I believe that even though we know it, we don't think about it. Especially as a mother of a Black son, you know, all I'm thinking is protecting him. And I say I'm also protecting my daughters. But you're right, sometimes because of society, they're brought to attention so often that he's the one that I tend to cry over when I worry about when he leaves the house, or my husband. And the girls, I worry about them, but it's a different feeling. It's hard to describe. And I feel that that's part of the hashtag Say Her Name movement. I think that especially in the last few years, with so much going on, it needed its own awareness. again, without talking about it. So I really do appreciate the fact that you named it for what it is and the history behind it. And so I think that it's appropriate to then move on to chapter 6. Is it chapter 6? Yes. Ubuntu, which means I am because we are.
Mhm.
And towards the end, on page 149, we talk about, you talk about many Black women in the United States do not have a transnational awareness of African descended women of the transatlantic slave trade, who also experience intersectional oppression and are also leading the charge to dismantle these systems. American exceptionalism fosters a myopic, self-centered, global North worldview that disregards less affluent countries. This lack of awareness is damaging to all African-descended Black women because it handicaps the power derived through transnational solidarity and mobilization. While alliance across borders is happening to some degree, an amplification and expansion of these alliances is critical. Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins wrote about the vital connection between the liberation of Black women in the United States and transnational alliances. Black women's empowerment involves revitalizing U.S. Black feminism as a social justice project organized around the dual goals of empowering African American women and fostering social justice in a transnational context. And I feel that that was an appropriate segue because we look at the patriarchy, we're looking at feminism, but we're also not realizing the global impact, and that around the world, people notice that that Black women in the United States, I believe, stand out. So what would you say to that?
It is, it is a really interesting idea, this concept. And I have to say that the work that's in this book, none of it is new, except for the US Census data and the Marist poll, right? So those two things I can say are new. But all of these ideas are ways in which Black women, particularly since the start of Reconstruction, have been saying, we are here, we are worthy, we have accomplishments, and not just accomplishments in terms of how we look at accomplishments or weigh accomplishments in a capitalist society, but also that we have value and worth because of who we are. And Black women have been saying that, for well over 150 years or more. And so I see myself as part of that continuum. So I am by no means saying that transnational alliance is like some great idea that nobody else thought about. It is something that Angela Davis in particular is really, hugely a part of, and has been for the last 50 years, really working with Afro-descendant women in Brazil and Guatemala and Honduras. I mean, this is work that has been done. What I am saying is that work has really been in the academy. It has really been in academia. It has really been in the institutions of higher learning in terms of thinking transnationally in this way. And so and that has to do with, as in the portion you read, has to do with American exceptionalism. And so American exceptionalism does not just impact white people, it impacts everybody who was born in this country. Even saying American exceptionalism when there's other countries in the Americas, should really be the United States exceptionalism, right? So even the phrase of that reveals that idea that this country, the United States, is, shines far above any, does no wrong, is, this beacon of light on a hill. And there are things about this country that are good, but there are also things about this country that are really bad and that need to change and that need to improve and that need to get better. And so the point that I was saying in terms of that idea of transnationalism is I was really thinking about how do we take all the lessons that have been learned really since the Civil War in terms of how to get full freedom? And so the enslaved thought, if we get education, everything will be the same. But then, after Reconstruction, there was Jim Crow and black codes and lynching. And as my father said to me, Black people were terrorized. And so then after that, even after the civil rights, there was mass incarceration and then drugs throughout the Black community. And then, so all of these things, right? And I'm thinking, and I was thinking really about what would be different. I was also thinking about the idea that that in terms of Black people in particular, even feminism, which really has a white feminist kind of connotation, right? I mean, in terms of Black women being a part of it, is that, and I talk about this a lot more in the book, but for white women, they could lean on white supremacy when it suits their benefit. And I'm saying in terms of mass movements and in terms of everyday life. Black men, when it suits them, can lean on patriarchy and the benefits that you get from that, right? And the benefits of being men. And that has been proven out in movements and in day-to-day life and just the statistics that I just mentioned. And so I was really thinking about who are the people who are not just like us, Black women in the United States, but who have a similar background as Black women in the United States. And so by that, because of the transformative nature and how it changed the world and the demonization of Black people and enslavement, I looked at the North Atlantic slave trade. And so because of American exceptionalism, we all think, oh, there's only racism in the US. In Canada, they're so nice. In Latin America, there's no such thing as race. Everybody is Indian and Black and European. It's all mixed and there's no racism, which none of that is true, right? And so you have the North Atlantic slave trade. And in the same way that, in the UK or England, they're racist and all that. I mean, it's still white Europeans, whether it was Spain or Portugal, France, or the United Kingdom. And that is the point that I'm making, that you have 4 million Africans who were brought to Brazil, and you have 400,000 who were brought to the United States. And so even though there are vast differences in language and culture, and food and attitudes across the Americas, so from Canada all the way down, what I'm saying is that the people that we should be fighting, not a national fight. I'm not even saying we should be fighting a global one. I'm saying the diaspora in the Americas is unique because of that slave trade. It is unique because of the enslavement. It is unique because Black women today are leading the battles all across the Americas in terms of freedom and equity as they are in the United States. So there's a woman in Canada named Robin Maynard. There's a problem in Canada around police brutality. And she wrote a recent book about that whole thing. And there's been recent studies that were done in the last couple of years in Canada that found that Black people, African descendant people, feel more in terms of, they feel racism at work, in the larger community, they feel more marginalized than any other group. If you look at Latin America, you see that same dynamic, particularly in Brazil, where there's, it's police brutality, but it's more around their paramilitary, right, in terms of brutality. And so in Honduras, you may have issues with land, where land that Black people have is being taken away by the government to build hotels. In the US, we call that gentrification. And so what I'm saying is that there is alignment in terms of the experiences, not perfectly aligned, and it doesn't need to be perfectly aligned. The experiences aren't homogeneous. We all have our own concerns, but there's power in the history and in the battle for full freedom, and that there should be a more systematic and strategic employment of people, of Black women, to work together for freedom, and we should be thinking vertically, not horizontally. And I
Thank
should,
you for that. Oh, go ahead, Chair.
yeah, I was just gonna to add to that just very quickly, is that the notion of Black or being Black is a very is an idea that's really based in the United States. How particularly in Central and South America, how they think about Blackness is very different. There's other names for it. However, the Afro-descendant aspect and that the awareness, and where you have more people saying they're Afro-Cuban or Afro-Honduras, or, I interviewed a number of these people for my book. There's an awareness of that connection in terms of that African descendantness, not necessarily the Blackness, how we think of it here, but being Afro-descendants.
Thank you for that, because I feel like everything comes into full circle where you started when you were talking about coming from Hartford and the Afro-Caribbean population, is part of that diversity, but that's not what we used to say. It was Jamaican and, Dominican and so on. And for me, that's why this book was also important, is understanding, and you have that chapter in terms of the grandmother or the older person that is of Dominican descent, and the comment that she made to you. Is it about the hair, or
yeah, I can just so
pretty?
people understand what we're saying. So I was talking about how that idea of color, like the idea of white supremacy, is prevalent throughout the whole world, but for the sake of this conversation, throughout the Americas, where colorism, that exists in Jamaica and the United States and other places. But I was talking about a older Dominican woman who I'm friends with her daughter, and I know her. And she said to me one day at an event, she saw me and she was like, "Oh, I just wish," and she's very light skinned, very light eyes, almost, but she was like, "Oh, you are so beautiful. I always wanted a daughter with dark skin like yours." Like, what she thought was beautiful was my darker skin. And so what's interesting about that is that actually in the Dominican Republic, people who are darker skinned are not treated the same as people who are lighter skinned, right? And Haiti, which they share an island, but two different countries, Haiti is considered, where they're darker and they're considered lesser than if in the Dominican Republic. And so it was sort of a twist on that. It was very similar to if a white woman in the United States was like, "Oh, I love all the different ways you do your hair. It's so cool." Right? I mean, it's a really loaded comment. Right? And so I understood that when she said that to me, but I don't know as much about those ideas about Blackness in other countries in the Americas as I do here. So I knew it meant something. I just wasn't sure what it meant. Yeah.
We could keep on talking. And I think that this actually, we could have done a breakout sessions and such. But because I'm sure that a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to read the book, now they're intrigued and will read the book. Just so you know, if you hadn't read in the description, there are copies at Trinity's bookstore. Of course, you can also pick it up in other locations such as Amazon. I got mine at bookshop.org because they sponsor small bookstores. So if you haven't grabbed your copy. Now, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. But as people are writing their questions, and Michelle is going to share some of them, or I think Michelle had mentioned that if you want to ask it directly, please make sure you use the raise hand icon so we can so we know that you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. But what was I saying? To my point is that even though this book was, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, was written for Black women, this is also for everyone to see a different perspective in terms of the Black female experience. And what is appreciated is that it's not just simply an opinion. Charity took the time to actually get data and included that. So it's a matter of fact and not opinion. So thank you, Charity, for your words, for rising us up. And I am going to put it to Michelle to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Yarel, and thanks, Charity. That was so interesting and that was great. I don't see questions here in the chat at this point. Does anybody have a question? I'm going to look through and see if there's any virtual raised hands. If anybody has a question, okay.
I
do
have
see
a question.
from Katie. I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump, but
Go right ahead, and then we'll get to
Hi, Rachel.
hi, Charity. Hi, Yarel.
Hi.
right
Hi,
ahead.
everybody. My question is, Charity, I know why as a Black woman I should read your book, but can you tell me why other people should read your book?
Thank you for that great question, Rachel. It's I use the word, my friends laugh at me because I say the word interesting a lot. I just do. Maybe it's, my like or whatever, but I specifically wrote the book for Black women. I wrote the book to center Black women and to propel Black women forward. And that's what I contended with. And I like to think about it the way Toni Morrison thinks about it, where she specifically wrote not in a way that censored the white gaze. And she would say she intentionally did not explain certain things in her book because she didn't want to decode it for anyone. Either you got it or you didn't get it. And so along the same lines, this was about really, anyone can read it, of course, but in terms of who I wrote it for and what they can get from it, that I don't know. I'm not sure about that because I wrote it specifically thinking of Black women and centering Black women. The other thing I would say, and I also get this from Toni Morrison, I was watching an old interview she did, and she had advice for, she said white people, but this could be advice for anyone. And she was also speaking particularly to people who are racist or contend with racism or embrace racism. And this isn't really for people who are consciously trying to do something about it or trying to think differently, okay? And so her advice was, which I think is brilliant, is that a person who adheres to racism, and in this context, she was talking about white racists, is that you have to first come to grips with your own fears. You have to come to grips with your history and what you need to do to change. And she said, leave me out of it. This is about contending with yourself and also realizing that race, it's not a real thing, right? We all know it's a social construct, but that there also is something called the white race. And who are you without whiteness? Are you smart? Are you interesting? Are you tall? Are you creative? And it's about really contending with history, who you are, and what needs to be done for you to change, and less about, and I think perhaps in my book, maybe you can come away thinking differently, but my audience was, for Black women. And I understand that could maybe deter some people from reading it, but I'm okay with that.
I just have to say thank you, Rachel, because that was one of my questions.
I know.
But because of time, I couldn't ask it. So it was perfect. See, class of 96 in the house, I'm just saying.
Yeah, there's another question from Katie. Katie, would you like to ask the question or would you like me to read the question? I'm not sure she's there. Okay, so Katie, I think may have stepped away. I'll read Katie's question. Would the Pan-American African diaspora efforts toward unity or struggling towards that for women, have there been divisions between sort of the global North and Central or South America?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, was that the end of the question?
Go right ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, so what I believe, I mean, Katie could clarify if she's still on. My sense is what she's saying is that I'm advocating for this systematic and structure and approach to tackling issues of equity and freedom, really for all communities, but that Black women should do it on a transnational, vertical rather than horizontal. What Katie is bringing up are the disputes or lack of continuity or agreement between different Afro-descendant groups in different countries. So yes, it exists, in terms of women. I mean, we're human. So, I see it as we're human and we have disagreements. What I'm suggesting is that shared legacy and where we're trying to go, that shared forward direction is more important. But if you have people, there will be conflict. So I just don't see it as a mitigating factor. It's just, okay, so people don't get along. And but there's more that and I almost don't want to use this phrase because it's so overused, but there's actually more that unites us, so more that we have in common. And so I see that as just petty. There are things to work through, but they're not the focus or reason not to move down that path.
Katie, I see you're back. Did you want to say anything or follow to that?
No, I'm just curious. I also, I majored in sociology. I got a PhD in sociology. Like, I'm just such a nerd about research methods that if nobody else has any other questions, I'd love to hear more about the research aspect of it and like what prompted you to really want to have that like anchor. Because I feel like a lot of people, they could write something that's like comes from the heart, comes from a personal narrative, and they don't feel compelled to anchor it in data. And I love that you did that.
Yeah, so I can tell you're a data nerd or that you have a PhD in sociology, because that is exactly the kind of thinking. It really comes from I believe having a sociology background in terms of undergrad, and also being a journalist where, first of all, as a journalist, and I was more of a general producer and reporter and media executive. I didn't focus on politics or business on that end. And one of the great things about journalism that I love and will always love is that you're always learning. Like something happens, there's in terms of the oil spill that happened and when the train derailment happened and not oil, but chemical spill that happened in Ohio, all these journalists had to then learn about the trains, how that works, right? What kind of component was it? Is it, talk to the EPA, talk to experts. And so that is just part of my training as a journalist. I also, and I want to shout out Tressie McMillan Cotton, who I love, amazing sociologist. And she has a book called Thick. And in her book, she makes the point that Black women are not believed or thought to be credible in any other field except for about Black women. And so a lot of times that comes down, so, a Black woman is believed in terms of her narrative and story. And that goes back to the slave narrative, right? So there's rich history there, but we're not believed in the same way to just be an expert as a doctor or to be an expert as a sociologist. It's like you can be an expert on Black women. And so the idea of storytelling and anecdotes and narratives has been done so much. And what I did not want, and I'll hold up the cover of my book here, where I have Power, the Rise of Black Women in America. For me, that's not an aspirational goal. It's a fact that I set out to prove. And so data was central to that because I wanted it to be anchored in something factual that could be replicated. So I worked with the University of Minnesota and the National Committee on Statistics to look at U.S. Census data from over 80-year period, from 1940 to 2019. And we looked at these three key areas, but essentially it was about centering Black women over time. So instead of comparing us to white men or white women, everybody's compared to white men, we were compared against ourselves over time. And so that is why I decided, that was very intentional. And as a journalist, you always want a new angle and a new, fresher way, because there's really nothing that new under the sun. But how I look at the data and how I gather it is new-ish, I can say. no one else has done that. And so when I say the rise and power of Black women, like that's a fact.
Charity, thank you. Unfortunately, it is 7:34 and we just have a couple more things to tie everything up. I want to say thank you for those of you who have remained, which has pretty much been everyone. So that's how good this session has been. Thank you again, Charity. So I'm going to move it to Laura to end things for us.
Oh, can I just say one thing really quickly? I was reading what people said about power, and I thought before we got started, and I just thought it was really interesting seeing all the different definitions. And one of the things that I've really been contending with is around the idea of power, women in general, but particularly Black women. And so I've been doing even more research on it since I wrote the book, but how we see power, how we operate in power, how we think of power from a Western, white supremacist patriarchal viewpoint, like how we all think about power from the ancient Greeks. It's just a really fascinating concept, but the overall argument I make is that you have to love power in order to create change. And so I just said I thought it was enjoyable to see everyone's comments. So thank you for that.
Okay, I think, Yarel, I think I'm up. Charity, thank you so much. I loved hearing you again. It was fantastic. You're an extraordinary person and writer, and just so honored to be sharing the screen with you tonight and having seen you in February as well. So thank you so much. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. By the way, I'm Laura Lockwood. I run the Women and Gender Resource Action Center called WAGRAC at Trinity College, and got my master's there in '95 in public policy and law. And I'm so honored to co-sponsor this event tonight with the Women's Leadership Council, of which I'm a member, a proud member. So again, Charity, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. It is just wonderful to see so many of you. And we really want to encourage you to spread the word about Charity's book, to read it. Well, first of all, buy it, read it, okay? And then spread it around. Go to Charity's website to find out more information, charityelder.com. I don't think we need to put that in the chat. It's pretty easy to remember, but please, right? But please do that. And I also want to let you know you're going to be getting a post-event survey, and we'd like you to fill that out. And we also, for those of you who are not members of the WLC and your alums, please become members. We want your participation. We want your voice. And we do amazing events like this and so much else during the year. So that the way to become a member will be made evident to you in the post-event survey that you'll be receiving. And lastly, we're wrapping up Women's History Month this next week. Believe it or not, it's almost April. So I wanted to call your attention to a couple things. Jess, would you be able to put that, or maybe it's already there?
I already put it in.
Okay, I can't see it for some reason, but yeah, thank you so much. There are several events next week to round up Women's History Month, and you could go to WAGRAC's website via Trinity's website, or look us up on Instagram at, I always forget our handle, at WAGRAC Trinity. But a very exciting event is happening on Thursday. We're co-sponsoring with the Temple of Hip Hop in honor of the 17th Trinity International Hip Hop Festival, which is happening next weekend. The keynote speaker is Imani Kai Johnson. She is going to discuss her new book, which is called Dark Matter in Breaking Cipher, The Life of Africanist Aesthetics in Global Hip Hop. We're uber excited to be co-sponsoring that with Temple, and hope you all can come. It is in person, but if you're in the area, come to Mather Hall, Rittenberg Lounge at 12:15. And I think that's about it.
Well,
Thank
we
you
have
so-
to announce our
Oh, the
raffle
winner.
winner.
Yes, I'm so
Yes.
sorry. Who
No,
does that?
no, I'm gonna
Is-
unpin you.
Okay.
So that I can show who the winner is. And the winner is class of 96. It's not me though. It's not me. Monitha Harris. Yay, Mo! Where are you? I'm trying to look for you so I can like share the spotlight.
I'm
but I
here.
can't find you.
And
There
wave.
you are.
I'm here.
Congratulations,
Thank
Monitha.
you.
So,
Yay!
what is Monitha receiving? She is receiving a signed copy
Woo!
of Power, the Rise of Black Women in America,
Woohoo!
along with maybe one or two other things in there, but you will have it in the mail. So Monitha, if you could share your contact information with Jess, you can do it privately to the alumni office, either that or she will reach out to you.
Okay.
Everyone,
Thank you.
Thank you,
I'm
everyone.
telling you, class of 96, I'm just saying.
We're still representing.
That is right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for attending. And this was, I think, a very important conversation that I hope everyone will keep in mind as you're also looking to purchase and read Charity's book. I have read it. I have already done a book club with it. I have attended several events to hear her speak. So I was, in case you can tell, I was looking forward to have this opportunity to have this conversation and share with all of you one of our amazing alumni. Do not forget to respond to the email, any feedback, and if you're interested in joining our committee, please let us know. Have a good night, everyone.